am now going to share already my screen as we begin. So the Torah prescribes different sin offerings depending on who made the mistake. And it enumerates 4 categories. What are the 4 categories? Looking at this beautifully colored, just to distinguish, you have the category of the high priest, the Supreme Court, the Nasi, which is president, but in this case, leader, and the category of the ordinary individual. Now, in 3 of the 4 cases, the law is introduced by the word if, im. If a person commits a sin. One case is introduced with the word when a person commits a sin. Can somebody tell me which one you think the verse says when this particular category commits a sin as opposed to if? Which of those 4? Is it the high priest, somebody in the Supreme Court, a leader, or an ordinary individual? I always say that there's not a right or wrong answer to get you to speak. In this case, there will be a right or wrong answer, but think about it. When would it say if, and one when? Somebody?
I would say Supreme Court, because they're going to judge them. So it's when, it's up in the air, and they have to prove it.
It's leader.
Okay, Simone, your answer was actually a good thought, but it is leader. Who said leader?
Gladys.
Gladys. Okay. Why? It's possible that the high priest, or as Simone said, somebody in the Supreme Court, a judge, or an ordinary individual will commit a sin. We know that. And a judge can make a mistake. But the thought is that a leader is likely to make a mistake. Very probable that he or she will. Why?
People aren't perfect.
Okay, people aren't perfect.
And they meet with so many different people, and there's so many different possibilities of encounters that, you know, it's likely that something will go wrong.
But I think a leader is in a position where he thought he's making many more decisions, possibly on behalf of other people, and it's easier for him to be in a situation where he could potentially make a mistake.
I think the leader, everybody is watching. Everybody is watching and looking up to the leader, and so they notice it.
I would go with.
Go ahead. Thank you, Shelley.
I don't know if it's my turn, but.
Go ahead, Rita.
I would say it's the ordinary individual who would make the statement when. The ordinary individual has no obligation to anybody but himself and would prejudge. The other 3 categories require some deliberation, some form of if ahead of the judgment.
Interesting, interesting. But I think Merle's thought really says what the commentators felt. There is no complete guidebook to a leader, whether it's a leader of a small community or whether it's of a family or whether it's a city or whether it's a country, because there are going to be different situations that perhaps you can't say for sure that this happened before, and therefore I know what. Every situation has its particular nature, and you will have to act accordingly. And that is very complicated. So it's conceivable, the commentators say, that a leader more than the other three will. Now that's just to get us going. This does not mean that the other three don't make mistakes. Of course they do. Of course they do. Of course they do. So let's discuss Nasi, leadership, today. Our tradition has known three forms of leadership: king, a Navi, prophet, and a Kohen, a priest. Now, let's look at text number 1. And this is from a commentator who wrote Aggadic texts regarding the Torah. And this specific text is relating to the debate of which is the principle on which Judaism depends. And this is what Rav Jacob ben Solomon ibn Habib of the 15th century said. Ben Zoma said, we find a more all-embracing verse, namely, Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. Ben Nanas said, there is a yet more all-embracing verse, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ben Pazi said, there is a more embracing verse still. Prepare one lamb in the morning and the other toward evening. A certain rabbi stood up and declared the law is in accordance with Ben Pazi. Why? Which leader is being given, so to speak, first billing here? The law
Kohanim.
isn't. Go ahead.
I think it's the Kohanim. with Ben
priest.
Pazi if there's the sacrifice.
Yeah. Okay, because he is responsible for the korbanot. Now, it seems odd. You would think Hero Israel represents faith, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself represents ethics. But instead, we have something talking about korbanot, sacrifices. Why? Anybody want to take an educated guess at why Ben Pazi felt that that captures the essence of Judaism? Anybody?
I think he understood that the people were going to sin, that it was a natural thing to have happened, and he was preparing in advance to sacrifice in order to do the sin offering.
Interesting, Marlene. Okay. He figured people naturally are going to sin, and so they're going to have to give sin offerings. Very cynical, very cynical. Anybody something different?
How about reverence for God, the important thing, the basic tenet?
Can you say more about that, Helen?
Well, I'm just looking at this. Love your neighbor as yourself is something we're taught and so on. And it's sort of behind it, you sort of think it's a God message or a God lesson. And in this case, what they're saying is most important thing is we have to start with our reverence and respect for God, and therefore the sacrifice.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, anybody else?
Rita.
Rita.
I think preparing the lamb, you're doing something. The other one, you're just saying love your neighbor, but the other one is actually doing something, performing an action, so that you're stopping and you're doing it for a reason. So that's what I think.
Also very interesting, Frida. Yeah, I think there was a time when I was growing up that we did prepare lamb chops, but then they became too expensive, right? Baby lamb chops. Okay, interesting answers. Let's take a break from this and we'll see what we have to say. Let's talk about the Navi, the prophet, and the Kohen, the priest. The difference. Now, who came first? A Navi and the priest. But what did Bnei Israel want? What did they ask of God? Which leader did they want that God didn't automatically suggest to them?
They wanted a king.
A king. Now we can sum up the king very quickly with what I just said. The fact that God hadn't even suggested they have a king, and in fact, suggested that it would be a mistake to have a king for a variety of reasons of what kings very often do, says that the king, we had kings. We had kings that did some wonderful stuff. But overall, the people that God was really looking to was the Navi, the prophet, and the priest. Now let's look at the difference. And we do not have a Navi today. We do not have a Kohen today, but we can substitute leaders that we do have today that try to fill those positions. So let's compare the prophet and the Kohen. The prophet wasn't just somebody who was saying what's going to happen in the future. The prophet was meant to challenge not just society, not just the Jewish people, but in fact, the king himself in the name of ideals. It was rare that a Navi and a Melech got along because the prophet was being very critical of the king. Now, the Navi would do this in the name of ideals. Something else about a prophet. Each one had his own personality, her own personality. In fact, we're not going to get into that, but there were several female prophets, prophetesses. And in having their own personality, one thing that they all shared was being charismatic. That was a quality that was very essential because in that way, they were able to influence people, attract them, and transform them, even if it was temporarily. The third thing about a prophet, the service of the prophet constantly changed. What does that mean? The prophet also, like the leader that Merle mentioned, had to constantly look at the particular situation because the Navi, the prophet, was functioning in reality, was responding to what was going on in history. The Navi, the prophet, was speaking the word of God for his time, a subject we've been talking about. And because of that, we're in history. The Kohen, the priest, on the other hand, was quiet, apolitical, and served in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. The Kohen was removed from people. The Kohen, unlike the Navi, the prophet, wore special clothing. And we'll see why that's significant in a moment. And there are formal protocols that have to do with being a Kohen. The service of the Kohen, the priest, never changed. Why? Because the Kohen was speaking the word of God for all time. It wasn't up to the Kohen to look at what's happening in the world. There were certain values and procedures that were meant to be eternal. The Kohanim, in a sense, in the way Helen was describing, gave a structure to revering God. So on the one hand, the Navi, in his charisma, lit the flame in the souls of the people, again, even if only temporarily. And the Kohen, the priest, was meant to tend that flame and turn it into that object that we haven't been near in months and months, the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, hanging on top of the bima in shul. Now, it would sound as if
Bracha, we can't
these,
hear you. Okay, we hear you.
what?
No, I couldn't hear you. I just didn't know if it was me or everyone else. Okay.
You're hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it would seem as if the Navi, the prophet, and the Kohen, the priest, would make a good couple, that they'd work together well. And in fact, no leader should act on his own. And you have different people specializing in different areas. And it sounds like a beautiful picture. I'm sorry, I'm looking at Rob Brickman, and I just pictured you and your dad up there on the bima, blessing us all. Zichrono Livracha. Okay. Now, I've just described the significance that each of these two leaders have. But unfortunately, we know that even a Navi, a prophet, and even a Kohen, a priest, could be brought down. I want you to suggest, what brings a leader down? A leader of any type. I'm going to suggest that there are probably at least 6 challenges that a leader faces and has to confront. So,
Here we are.
anybody?
Now I have to remember what to do next week.
Hi, Pearl. Good to see
Hi.
you. But please mute yourself. Isn't that a nice way to greet somebody I haven't seen in a few years?
That's right. Goodbye.
Okay.
Bye-bye. I have.
Okay, I think I did it. Okay, so anybody want to suggest?
Well,
What
when
brings
people
a
don't
leader
listen,
down?
when
I'm
people
sorry,
don't
Bev.
listen- When people don't listen to you, when they turn against whatever you're saying, would bring a leader down. When they're not,
Okay, I don't think I expressed myself properly. I don't mean when do we get rid of a leader. I meant what makes a leader fail or sin, not live up to his responsibility as a leader. That's what I meant.
When a leader becomes too full of themselves and is not addressing the needs of the people he serves, that is enough to bring him down.
Or losing touch with what that the community that he or she is serving. You know, when that leader loses that connection with the needs of that community.
Yes, two good answers. Anybody else?
When the ego overtakes
Right.
the thinking of the other.
Okay, three.
When the leader forgets what his or her mission is, and puts his own or her own needs first.
Okay, good. Four different answers. Anybody else?
Power
Yes,
hungry.
yes, I have an answer. When he hides the truth, he's living a lie, and someone finds out, and then everyone finds out.
So is it when he's found out that he's sinned or when he's actually done it, Sarah?
When he's done it,
Yeah,
and he tries to hide it.
okay. I'm going to share again. Okay, so let's look at text 2a and 2b. So we talk again, we mention this tabernacle, which really, the more I think about it, is so significant. These are the amounts of the materials used for the tabernacle of the testimony, which were recorded at Moses' command by the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aaron, the priest. What is this? Moshe, without being asked or told to, offers not just an inventory, but he explains, and it goes on in the future verses, to say this amount of money went for this, and this amount went for that. So this is an example of there being a need for accountability and transparency. And if you look at 2b, kings, which is later in history, they did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers because they acted with complete honesty. What does this verse do to the preceding one? It makes it clear that they didn't automatically have a ritual of saying, okay, you've got to show us your books. No. Now, what that means, that speaks of Moses' character, because he did something, it's a good expression to know, beyond the letter of the law, lifni mishurat adin. He wasn't asked, but he himself felt he wants to make it clear, because remember, everything that Moshe does until the day he's no longer with us is to teach Bnei Israel, the Israelites, what's expected of them. So everything that he does or says is meant to be watched and observed, as somebody said, perhaps Sarah. So Moshe introduced this idea of transparency, not the modern day move for transparency, but this has existed in our tradition for a very, very long time. Now, can somebody tell me how the swearing in ceremony of the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel is different from the swearing in of the Prime Minister of Canada? I'm talking specifics, the ceremony of the inauguration or the swearing in. Think of what goes on What does the ceremony entail? Somebody? So if you don't know Israel, you should know the United States, your neighbor. Or if you know Canada, then say what Canada does, and then I'll tell you how it's different from Israel and the US.
Swearing in the Bible.
I hear two people.
Both parties have to agree. The opposition, and they have to have an agreement between both of them.
Okay, Frida, I'm not getting into that. I'm actually talking literally about the actual ceremony. I heard somebody say something Bible.
Swearing on the Bible, their hand on the Bible.
Okay, so in the United States and in Israel, you put your left hand on the Bible and you raise your right hand in the air. Do you know what happens in Canada? Anybody?
Yes, you swear allegiance to the Queen, right? No?
Well, you also take a vow that you're going to serve, but now I'm talking about your hands.
Oh, hands.
Interesting. Look it up. In Canada, the Prime Minister, when he's taking this vow, has both hands
On the
on the
Bible.
Bible. Now, Rabbi Daniel Nevins, who is stepping down very shortly from being the dean of the rabbinical school of JTS, explains the following. The left hand for most is the weaker hand. So when you put the left hand on the Bible, you are admitting that you are going to serve your people, hopefully well, not because of your muscles, but because of the strength that you are going to glean from God and his Bible. Now, what is the right hand? What does that symbolize? That it's in the air and it's empty? Anybody? Transparency. There's nothing there, and you're going to get to see everything. So, please mute. So, this is the first challenge. Have to be accountable, have to be transparent. We expect that. Now, challenge number 2. And I think somebody alluded to this one as well. See, these verses that ordinarily might seem, is it important? We glean from this, I believe, and I'm not the only one, some incredibly significant, meaningful ideas. So again, in talking about the tabernacle, 3a and 3b, they shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall cover it with pure gold. From inside and from outside you shall cover it. And you shall make upon it a golden crown all around. Is there anything in that verse that you find a little puzzling or surprising? You're going to put the gold where?
Where it's not seen.
Yeah. Why put it inside? It's not going to be seen. Very good. Let's look at 3b. From inside and from outside you shall cover it, from Masachet Yoma in the Talmud. Rava said, this alludes to the idea that any Torah scholar or any leader whose inside is not like his outside i.e., whose outward expression of righteousness is insincere, is not to be considered a Torah scholar or a leader. Not only is such a person not to be considered a Torah scholar, but he is called loathsome. Any leader, he happens to use here the Torah scholar. So here we're talking about somebody who is not genuine, perhaps two-faced, and we know how common that is with leaders. Now, let's look at this, which I think is incredible. It's written by Rav Doron Perez, who happens to be the national or international director of Mizrahi. I believe our sages' adversity to this quality of inauthenticity also explains the extreme view that the sages had toward the chazir, the swine. I find it quite remarkable that many Jewish people who regularly eat non-kosher meat are somehow strict when it comes to not eating pork. What is it that makes the meat of the swine less kosher than other non-kosher meat? There certainly isn't any halachic difference. While some point to the fact that the swine is a particularly dirty animal, spending much time in a mixture of mud and feces, there seems to be a much deeper reason. Our sages say that there is another quality regarding the swine that creates a moral stench. As we all know, the pig is the only animal which has cloven hooves on the outside, and this is being a sign of a kosher animal, yet does not chew the cud on the inside. So that's a sign of a non-kosher animal. So to speak, the swine, very smart, shows everybody on the outside that it is kosher, yet its external sign of kashrut does not match what it has on the inside, a lack of the other necessary internal sign of kashrut. I just thought that's incredibly clever. Professor Stephen Covey, I'm sure you're familiar, he's written a lot of these help books, offers an important insight, everyday greatness, into the concept of integrity. He says that in mathematics, an integer is a number that is indivisible into fractions. Just so, a man of integrity should not be divided against himself. What he thinks, says, and does should all be one. He should not be in conflict with his own principles. He continues to say that the word integrity basically means to be integrated around principles. It means a wholeness, oneness, and seamlessness. Now, why are there so many leaders who don't have this integrity? Why are there elected leaders who speak in opaque terms? I'll repeat that. Why are there elected leaders who speak in opaque terms? Why? And that's why they become two-faced and don't stick to their principles. Why? What are they concerned with more than desire for truth? What are they concerned with?
Votes.
Votes and being popular.
The whole system turns somebody who wants to do right by the country, by the people, but the system itself pushes people that are vying for votes and for that position of power in a way that's quite unpleasant.
Now, some will say that they're just hoping they're doing what they feel they need to do to get into power, and then they'll be okay. Doesn't always work that way. You know, there are people that some citizens would like to see go for the Knesset because they have all the wonderful qualities: charismatic, devoted, learned, smart. And a couple of them refuse, saying that they fear that even though they're a good person, they'll become corrupt. They'll become corrupt. And that's very scary to think that that keeps people who might be okay away. Now, this doesn't mean to say,
Bracha, I think that what Sipora said is right. The systems of the political systems, if you're going to manage, then you have to win votes. You have to compromise all the time. And that compromise involves in compromising your principles.
yeah, but how do you get away from that, Linda? Linda?
I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Okay, it's a real problem. It's a real problem. Any other challenges that haven't been mentioned yet? Actually, I think Sarah mentioned, I think it was you, who talked about the leader having to be sure of what he stands for, not just stands for, but giving a vision to the community, to his citizens. There being a long-term vision, not just dealing with from today till tomorrow. And together with that, a challenge and a weakness is when you have a leader who is not preparing the next generation to take over. That's a real problem. That's a real problem. Now, we mentioned charisma before, and I spoke of it very positively. You need a leader who's going to attract, who's going to inspire, but what is the weakness of a charismatic leader? What's the weakness there?
He can lead people astray.
Okay, that is, people become so enthralled with this person and even idolized. That is definitely a problem. And then those people are crushed when they find out that that leader is not what they expected or thought that he or she was. Another reason that charisma isn't the answer.
Well, I think people who have charisma have very healthy egos usually. And what is the dividing line between their ego and their looking out for others?
Okay. This also can be a third possibility. Anyone?
I'll say something.
Yes.
How about the fact that when people have charisma, then crowds are more interested in following them just because of the charisma, not because of what they're saying or what their plans are. But they're so taken with I guess just their being that they follow them for those reasons and not for what's really much more important.
Also, Bracha, I was thinking that there's a difference between being charismatic and having knowledge. There can be a gap that if somebody is so charismatic, but he's not a knowledgeable politician. He doesn't have a background in how to deal with issues, and yet be a wonderful person on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Bracha, what you haven't touched on here, it's not an answer to your question, is power. And power corrupts.
And
And
the more
that's
power,
really
the more
an important thing, because even if a leader starts off in all intent of purity and goodness, once that power comes in, you know what they say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes, Helen, and we are going to address that in a few moments. Getting back to, I think it was Etta who spoke. That is a problem. When you have a character who people are taken with the person and not necessarily the content, well, what happens when that person goes away?
But you know what, Bracha, you're absolutely right. And we've just had an example of that in the United States. You had a man who had no plan, and basically it was his personality that won over people, and people followed him blindly, and many of them still are. And there was no substance behind the post that he put out to the people.
Actually, at the risk of, I mean, I think that's what Trudeau is now. I mean, he's got charisma, but he doesn't have a skill set. He doesn't have a sense of what is important. He definitely is not transparent. I think he's covered up a gazillion times. I mean, to me, he's not a leader.
You know, the other thing, going back to what Linda said earlier about people very often will follow the charisma, or you'll find the charismatic leader. If people were willing, when they stand up and start talking in order to get elected, if they would be willing to say that not everything is black and white, and there are times when things are going to be shades of gray, and I may have to compromise what I am saying right now in order to benefit the people. I'm not sure whether they would get the votes at that time, but certainly, at least if they had to do that, they'd have told the truth up front.
And I am beginning to think more and more that these days, especially, but always, that a leader sometimes has to be able to say, I apologize, or the situation has changed, so that what I thought I could do, what I thought I might have been able to do when from yesterday is not what I can do today. And I think that we faced that situation in this last year many, many times. I would prefer somebody who had the guts to say, I'm sorry. I'm just sorry for some of the decisions I've made. They weren't correct decisions.
Yeah, but on the other hand, lots of times leaders do say that. And the people are not willing to forgive them. They'll say, well, this is what I had hoped, but we had to compromise. And then the populace is against him.
Okay.
I was going to say that I think that what we're coming up to now, both in the United States and in Canada, is that even the populace is electing people who only have charisma. It's obvious, well, in the United States, when you had somebody who got to the position of where he is by putting other people down and not by policy decisions, and he still got elected. So that it's part of their responsibility. It sort of still goes back to the people who are electing. There was never really an agenda. And if you go further, we end up with the United States. And I think it's like the elephant in the room. That's the United States president was a friend of Israel, and is the people who are supposed to be a light to the nation. We know inside, we may not, but he did things. It's like somebody said to me once, yes, but even a stop clock is right twice a day. So you can make the right decisions, but yet you're still not a person by definition is a good leader.
Yeah, no, and
I just would like to remind people that they use the word charisma with this present Trudeau's father. They use that
who had his strengths and weaknesses, and they used the same word of charisma with Bill Clinton, who certainly had his weaknesses. So you have to be careful about the word charisma, and go beyond and deeper inside. Would people say that Obama has charisma? Well, it depends on whether if you've actually read how he thinks and whether you would find that charismatic. You have to be really careful about these things.
But they had policies beforehand. They had education, and whether you agreed or not agreed, there was something that you could base your decision on who you're electing. And in this case, I think, just in my opinion, is that in the United States, especially, that when people elected the previous president, it was based on more like a gut, and I relate to him, and just not by what's he going to do really good. There wasn't anything of any substance at all before. Like it's, that's, they woke up, and that's just a feeling,
Okay. So in raising this issue of charisma and suggesting that it is fleeting, that can die out and not have long-term results, it points to the function of the Kohanim, the priests, and their rituals. I mentioned earlier, unlike the prophets, the priests wore special clothing. Why? What did that symbolize? I've already said that the priest represented the eternal values, that no matter what's going on, these are going to live on. The clothing, the uniform that the priest would wear showed that the office is greater than the person. I'm going to repeat that.
Yeah.
Clothing that the priest wore is to show the office is greater than the person. And I quickly picture, as I watched The Crown, the times that the royalty would get dressed a certain way, despite whatever we think of the monarchy or not, that represents to me something beyond your own person. Okay, now,
Good point. Yeah.
what are some instructions that the Tanakh gives us as far as dealing with these problems? So you remember that shortly after they left Egypt, they were attacked by the Amalekites, Bnei Israel in the Midbar. And picture this scene. As long as Moshe held his hands up, the Israelites prevailed. But when he let his hands down, the Amalekites prevailed.
On the top.
When Moses' hands became weary, they took a stone and placed it under him so that he would be able to sit on it. Aaron and Hur then held his hands, one on each side, and his hands remained steady until sunset. What's going on in these two verses? What's going on here? Is it reflecting a miracle that Moshe holds the staff up and they prevail? Is that what it's meant to say? Or is it a reminder that God is with them? Or is there something else going on here?
And Moshe has to be able to inspire the people. It seems that as soon as he's not there to inspire them, they weaken.
Okay, good. So that's the first thing. Moshe, like every leader, is meant to inspire and to give his people confidence and to get them to look up. And that's part of the long and the vision that a leader has to give people, so to speak, a metaphor for that. He gets them to look up. Now, What else does the leader have to do? He doesn't want the people to be dependent on him because he's not always going to be there. So how do we see that in what happens with Aaron and Hur, who was a colleague of Moshe and Aaron, so to speak?
Well, he's got supporters, he's got background, he's got people who are helping with the vision.
He's empowering them to help him. Exactly, Ellen. Exactly. Now, some more instructions. And this relates to something that somebody said a while ago today from Deuteronomy. When the king is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of the Torah, this teaching, written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him and let him read it all his life so that he may learn to revere God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching as well as these laws. Thus, he will not act. This gets to your point, Ellen, about power and your attitude about yourself. Thus, he will not act haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. And the Talmud goes on, the king shall not accumulate many horses for himself, but only enough for his chariot in war and in peace. Neither shall he greatly accumulate silver and gold. This is what God warned Bnei Israel for himself, but only enough to provide his soldiers sustenance, aspanya. And the king writes himself a Torah scroll for his sake, as stipulated in Deuteronomy. When he goes out to war, he brings it out with him. When he comes in from war, he brings it in with him. When he sits in judgment, it is with him. When he reclines to eat, it is opposite him, as it is stated, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. I'm sure that King David had that Bible with him when he was with Bathsheba, right? I couldn't resist that. Now, but this is the bottom line. Any leader is a servant of the people because we need somebody to coordinate everything. But don't think that you are the king. Now, two concluding texts, and this takes us back to the very beginning.
Yeah.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this gets back to, I think it was Merle who said, do we have leaders who will apologize? And Yochanan ben Zakkai, in the time of the Romans, who we think of as Lag BaOmer approaches, a great rabbi, said, when he was talking about this pasuk, I've got to go, of giving sin offerings, look at the word when. In the Hebrew, Aleph Shin Resh, Asher. It means a few things. When. Anybody know a word that's from that shoresh? If you add a yud, what does it mean?
Happy.
Ashrei, happy. Osher, happiness. So look what he builds, Yochanan ben Zakkai. He says, happy is the generation whose leader is willing to bring a sin offering for his mistakes.
Yes.
So I'd like you to take a moment now, copy that, and send it to Joe.
There's a long list.
Okay. Now, this next concluding text, I think, captures everything we have said today. And I want you to tell me who said this. And think of what values are included in this selection. Whether you hold humble office in a municipality or in a small union or high office in a national government, the principles are the same. You must know what you want to achieve. We said that. Be certain of your aims and have these goals constantly in mind. You must fix your priorities. Any leader is going to have to do that, and people will have to understand that. You must educate your party, the next generation, and must educate the wider public. You must have confidence in your people, often greater than they have in themselves. For the true political leader knows instinctively the measure of man's capacities and can rouse him to exert them in times of crisis. You must know when to fight your political opponents and when to mark time. You must never compromise on matters of principle. You must always be conscious of the element of timing, and this demands a constant awareness of what is going on around you. In your region, if you are a local leader, in your country, and in the world, if you are a national leader. And please mute.
We are seeing
And since
the end of family secrets.
and somebody has to mute themselves, please. And since the world never stops for a moment, and the pattern of power changes its elements like the movement of a kaleidoscope, and that was the role of the Navi, you must constantly reassess chosen policies toward the achievement of your aims. That was said tonight. A political leader must spend a lot of time thinking, and he or she must spend a lot of time educating the public and educating them anew. Will not see a name there. Who wrote that?
Sharansky?
No.
Churchill.
No, not Churchill.
Golda
Ben
Meir.
Not Golda Meir.
Ben Gurion.
Not Abba Eban. Somebody who was not Shomer Mitzvot, but Bible was so important to him.
Begin.
Ben
Begin.
Gurion.
Yeah,
David
Ben Gurion.
Someone said that.
Gurion
Ben Gurion.
says it all. And he's running in the 5th set of elections that we will no doubt have. Okay. So there's another ill that must be fixed somehow, never ending. Anybody else want to share a suggestion of what else should be done with our leaders, to our leaders? Should we bring them down as Bev suggested? Okay, all right. So, people, continue to stay well. Keep your spirits up. We know it's very, very hard. Very, very hard. But you will.
Enjoy Lag Bomer.
Bracha, excellent.
Enjoy Lag Omer.
Very good, yeah.
We're being very careful with the size of the fires that we're allowed to light. So, okay. Chag Sameach.
That's a
Thanks, Mayor. Bye, everyone.